We're joined by Guy Keller, Portfolio Manager of the Tribeca Nuclear Energy Opportunities Fund. Guy, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me this morning. Appreciate it.
A 5-year-old fund. When you started, how much interest was there in nuclear energy and the whole thematic?
Very little. In fact, when we started looking at the thesis and just realised it was really interesting because there wasn't enough uranium being produced and the price was too low, and started making some phone calls, there was CEOs of junior mining companies who were sort of falling over themselves, wondering who I was and why I was suddenly showing an interest. So I think it was maybe 2 or 3 of us globally who were trying to specialise in the sector back then.
But you did the work. You had a thesis. You convinced others to come on board. This wasn't a flash in the pan, hey, uranium's cool again. You did the work to get to where you wanted to be.
Yeah, look, exactly, and it was part of sort of how we approach things at Tribeca and in our global natural resources platform. We do a lot of top-down work, or I do a lot of the top-down work on how the commodities look with demand and supply, where prices are and what have you. And uranium just flagged as broken. It had been a really healthy sector in the lead up to the tragedy in Fukushima of 2011, and basically the rug got pulled overnight on investment and interest in the sector. So, you know, as we've sort of coming to along the theme of decarbonisation and electrification, we very quickly realised that if you can't achieve decarbonisation if the source of your electricity is full of carbon, and whilst renewables were playing their part, nuclear power is the only source of low to zero carbon baseload electricity capable of still producing when the wind's not blowing and the sun stops shining.
So what was the thesis? What was the idea that piqued your interest?
Again, there was a very easy demand curve to model because reactors, there's 450 odd reactors operating in the world, and the decisions to shut them down at the end of their operating life are 2 or 3 or 4 years out. New builds are 2 or 3 or 4 years or longer. So you can see that demand, and every year the supply was going down. It was being filled by inventory and other sources of secondary supply. That was starting to dry up. But more importantly, there was an acceptance globally that nuclear power actually had a role to play in decarbonisation. And so governments of countries that had nuclear power started to make decisions to say, you know what, maybe we should keep these things running.
Were you surprised that no one else saw that vision?
Not really. There'd been a number of false starts. I've met a number of people over the years who got burned by being long uranium equities at the top of the cycle, 2010, 2011, and said it was broken. And to be fair, it was broken for many years. It wasn't in vogue, and countries were looking to roll that back. I mean, France, 70% of their electricity being nuclear, they were wanting to bring that back to 45 or 50. They've since pivoted and going back to 70 or staying at 70 and now wanting to build more. But so, there was not a lot to excite people, and I think people had a few bites at the cherry in what may look like recoveries. It didn't work, and they'd sort of given up on the sector.
Fast forward, what was the aha moment when everyone realised this is something, and this is a commodity that we should be focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, ironically, the cause of the first move was April 2020, and it was actually COVID that got the sector moving off a really, really low base, mind you. And that was that realisation of emerging market economies were producing a lot of the raw materials and having much more difficulty in dealing with COVID and their populations, whereas the developed countries were still sort of ticking along. And when you look at uranium, for example, 40 to 50% of it comes from Kazakhstan, and then in Canada as well, they were trying to shut down production because of COVID. So that was sort of the moment where people went, hang on a second, and we did get some movement, but it was, as I said, just a small kick off a very low base. But yeah, certainly more eyeballs were on the space then.
Fast forward to now, what does the macro environment look like, and why are you excited about the opportunity with nuclear?
I mean, it's extraordinary. Everybody says to me, what are the catalysts and what's going to finally move the sector? And I say, look, the catalysts are out there. You've got global governments, passing legislation to support nuclear power. You've got global governments passing legislation to make those investments in new nuclear as green investments, meaning that you can now go and borrow at a green rate, which brings the cost down significantly. You've got green groups accepting globally that nuclear has a part to play in the world. And we've got one of the biggest reactor build programs going on that we've seen in decades, and it's not just China. There's a dozen countries. You look through that to the end of this decade, people always ask me, is technology going to displace the thesis? And I say, well, hang on, in this case, technology is actually adding to the demand thesis, because the technology is to roll out small modular reactors, smaller versions of the same technology, and be able to put those into old coal-fired power plant sites where the infrastructure is already there. And remember, transmission and grid costs a lot of money to build those from scratch. So I look through that and think, I've got a healthy demand profile out to 2030. I've got supply that can respond but needs to be at a higher price. And then from 2030 onwards, we see almost a battery electric vehicle type situation where back in 2015 or 16, nobody got lithium demand right. And everybody was wrong because they were too low. And they say, how are you modelling that? I say, whatever number I try to throw at that into the next decade is going to be too low.
A long-term view, but a correct thesis. Exciting times ahead for Tribeca and the fund. Guy, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.